This glossary of video game terms lists the general video game industry terms as commonly used in Wikipedia articles. 0 to 9. 1-up. In games where players have a number of lives to complete a game or level, an object, or the act of gaining an extra life. The term 1UP also commonly referred to player number 1. Two-player games scores were displayed as 1UP and 2UP. 8-bit, a descriptor for hardware or software that arose during the third generation of video game consoles, targeting 8-bit computer architecture. 16-bit, a descriptor for hardware or software that arose during the fourth generation of video game consoles, targeting 16-bit computer architecture. 2D graphics. The game features two-dimensional objects. 2.5D graphics. A game consisting of 3D graphics set in a 2D plane of movement, where objects outside of this 2D plane can have an effect on the gameplay. 32-bit, a descriptor for hardware or software that arose during the fifth generation of video game consoles, targeting 32-bit computer architecture. 3D graphics. 3D graphics. The game features three-dimensional objects. 4X, a genre of strategic video games, short for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. 64-bit, a descriptor for hardware or software that arose during the fifth generation of video game consoles, targeting 64-bit computer architecture. A high-budget game with a large development team, or game studios that make them. AAA games are usually multi-platform, have multi-million-dollar marketing budgets, and plan to sell over 1 million copies. Abandon, where the idea of a game being forgotten about, or abandoned by the developers for multiple different reasons, one being copyright issues. Act. C-level action point, a subunit of a player's turn. For example, during each turn, a player can take a set number of actions, each costing a point. Action role-playing game, a genre of role-playing video games where battle actions are performed in real time instead of a turn-based mechanic. Actions per minute, the total number of actions the player can perform in a minute. AFK, abbreviation of away from keyboard, generally said through a chat function in online multiplayer games when a player is temporarily unavailable and doing something else. Aggro. See hate. Causing aggro is the act of performing aggressive actions in a video game in order to attract attention of NPCs to defeat the player character. Often used in gaming to grind. Aimbot, a first-person shooter cheat that lets players shoot other player characters without aiming. In most cases, the reticle locks onto a target within the player's line of sight and the player only has to pull the trigger. Aimbots are one of the most popular cheats in multiplayer FPS, used since 1990's Quake Alpha release, the alpha version of a game. The stage of development before beta. Always-on DRM, a type of digital rights management that typically requires the player to be always connected to the internet to play the game. Analog stick, a small variation of a joystick, usually placed on a game controller to allow a player more fluent two-dimensional input than is possible with a D-pad. AO, abbreviation of Age of Empires, abbreviation of Area of Effect arcade game, a coin-operated game machine. Area. C-level area of effect, a term used in many role-playing and strategy games to describe attacks or other effects that affect multiple targets within a specified area. For example, in the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, a fireball spell will deal damage to anyone within a certain radius of where it strikes. This term is not limited to just role-playing games. However, in most tactical strategy games, artillery weapons have an area of effect that will damage anyone within a radius of the strike zone. Area of effect can also refer to spells and abilities that are non-damaging and non-explosive. For example, a powerful healing spell may affect anyone within a certain range of the caster. Many games also have what are sometimes referred to as aura abilities that will affect anyone in the area around the person with the ability. For example, many strategy games have hero or officer units that can improve the morale and combat performance of friendly units around them. The inclusion of AO elements in game mechanics can increase the role of strategy, especially in turn-based strategy games. The player has to place units wisely to mitigate the possibly devastating effects of a hostile area of effect attack. However, placing units in a dense formation could result in gains that outweigh the increased AO damage received. Point-blank area of effect is a subset of AO in which the affected region is centered on the character that is performing the ability, rather than a location of the player's choosing. That term, however, is rarely used by players because of its relatively higher complexity to spell out. Thus AO is more favorably used, especially in MMO games. ARPG, abbreviation of action role-playing game. Attract mode, also known as display mode or show mode. Attract mode is a pre-recorded demonstration of a video game that is displayed when the game is not being played. Originally built into arcade games, the main purpose of the Attract mode is to entice passers-by to play the game. It usually displays the game's title screen, the game's story, its high score list, sweepstakes, and the message "Game Over" or "Insert Coin Over," or in addition to a computer-controlled demonstration of gameplay. In Atari home video games of the 1970s and 1980s, the term Attract mode was sometimes used to denote a simple screensaver that slowly cycled the display colors to prevent phosphor burn-in while the game was not being played. Attract modes demonstrating gameplay are common in current home video games. Attract mode is not only found in arcade games but in most coin-operated games like pinball machines, stacker machines, and lots of other games. Cocktail arcade machines on which the screen flips its orientation for each player's turn in two-player games traditionally have the screen's orientation in player 1's favor for the Attract mode. Auto-aim, also known as aim assist, is a gameplay mechanic built into many games to decrease the level of difficulty. The game itself has the ability to lock onto or near targets for faster aiming. Games such as the newer Grand Theft Auto titles utilize hard or soft aim settings to respectively either lock directly onto an enemy or assist the player's aim towards the enemy while giving some freedom of precision for headshots. It is not to be confused with Aimbots. Balance beta release, an early release of a video game following its alpha release, where typically the game developer seeks to remove bugs prior to the released product through feedback from players and testers. Board C-level, bonus stage A-level, that is usually unlocked and not normally on the level choose screen until unlocked. Boss, an opponent non-player character in a video game that is typically much more difficult to defeat compared to normal enemies, often representing the end of a level or a game. Buff, an effect played on a video game character that beneficially increases one or more of their characteristics for a temporary period. Bullet hell, a type of shoot 'em up where generally the player must dodge an overwhelming large number of enemies and the projectiles. Campaign mode, a campaign mode, story mode, or simply campaign refers to one of several possible operating modes of a game in which levels are specifically encountered in a linear or branching fashion, often with more story elements present compared to other modes. Camping, a controversial strategy in which a player stays in one place, preferably a fortified, high-traffic location, for an extended period of time and waits to ambush other players. It is most common in first-person shooter games. Spawn camping, or spawn killing, is a related strategy in which players camp at a spawn point. Character class, a character type with distinct abilities and attributes both positive and negative, such as a warrior, thief, wizard, or priest. Cheating, to play the game unfairly, giving an unfair advantage via illegitimate means. Checkpoint, see saved game. Chiptune, music composed for the microchip-based audio hardware of early home computers and gaming consoles. Due to the technical limitations of earlier video game hardware, chiptune came to define a style of its own. Known for its soaring flute-like melodies, buzzing square-wave bass, rapid arpeggios, and noisy gated percussion, Class C character class cinematic C cutscene circle strafing clipping, a game technology that turns objects into solid, impenetrable barriers. Also see no-clip, a cheat where clipping is disabled. Close beta, a beta period where only specific people have access to the game's CMS, abbreviation of Construction and Management Simulation. Coin-op C. Arcade game combo, combinations of attacks in a fighting game, during which an opponent is helpless to defend themselves. Introduced in beat-em-ups as Double Dragon and Renegade, and becoming more dynamic in Capcom's fighting games Final Fight and Street Fighter II. To correctly execute a combo, a player needs to learn complex series of joystick and button combinations. Competitive gaming C. Electronic sports console, a video game hardware unit that typically connects to a video screen and controllers, along with other hardware. Unlike personal computers, a console typically has a fixed hardware configuration defined by its manufacturer and cannot be customized. Construction and management simulation, a video game genre that involves planning out and managing a population of citizens in towns, cities, or other population centers. In such games, the player rarely has direct control of the computer-controlled citizens and can only influence them through planning. Continue, a common term in video games for the option to continue the game after all of the player's lives have been lost, rather than ending the game and restarting from the very beginning. There may or may not be a penalty for doing this, such as losing a certain number of points or being unable to access bonus stages. In arcade games, when a player loses or fails an objective, they will generally be shown the Continue Countdown screen, in which the player has a certain limited amount of time to insert additional coins in order to continue the game from the point where it had ended. By pressing the Start button, deciding not to continue will result in the displaying of a game over screen. The Continue feature was added to arcade games in the mid-1980s due to arcade owners wanting to earn more money from players who played for longer periods of time. The first arcade game to have a Continue feature was Fantasy, and the first home console cartridge to have this feature was the Atari 2600 version of Vanguard. As a result of the Continue feature, games started to have stories and definite endings. However, those games were designed so that it would be nearly impossible to get to the end of the game without continuing. Salin and Zimmerman argue that the Continue feature in games such as Gauntlet was an outlet for conspicuous consumption. Controller, a means of control over the console or PC you are playing the game on. Control pad, CD pad, control point, a game mode which involves the team capturing each required capture point in order to win the round or level, also known as a CP. Control stick, C analog stick, conversation tree, C dialogue tree, cooldown, the minimum length of time that the player needs to wait after using an ability before they can use it again. This concept was first introduced by the Texmud Avalon. The legend lives, similar to the reload time and firing rate of weapons. For example, a machine gun has very fast firing rate, so it has a very low cooldown between shots. Comparatively, a shotgun has a long reload cooldown time between each shots. Cooldown also can be used to balance a weapon such as a turret-mounted machine gun having infinite ammunition, since it can only sustain continuous fire until reaching a threshold at which the weapon would have to cool down before it could be fired again. In design terms, cooldown can also be thought of as an inverted casting time, where instead of requiring a wait time before using an ability, cooldown may replace casting time and put the wait after the ability is activated. This creates a new dimension to the balancing act of casting speed versus power. Lower cooldown, faster cast but weaker strength, versus higher cooldown, slower cast but greater strength. This sort of mechanic is integral to such games as World of Warcraft, where cooldown management is key to higher-level play and various abilities deal with cooldown. From the technical point of view, cooldown can also be used to assert control over frequency of cast in order to maintain a fluid frame rate and ping. For example, in the game Diablo 2, cooldown was added in the form of a patch to several graphically and CPU-intensive spells to solve the problem of extreme lag caused by players spamming these spells in multiplayer. Moves and attacks in fighting games have the amount of time each of them take to execute measured in frames. Each move has a certain amount of frames in which it is considered to be recovering before another move can be executed, which is similar to cooldowns in concept. However, unlike the concept of the cooldown, where a move, spell or ability is considered to be cooling down before it can be used again, but control over one's character unit is still available. The recovery frames of a move in a fighting game do not allow the player to perform any other attacks or movement until the move has fully recovered. Because of this mechanic, strategic use of skills is necessary to make sure the opponent cannot immediately counter the player during the recovery phase of an attack, since it leaves the player wide open. Corruptor, a computer program used either as or in conjunction with an emulator to corrupt certain data within a ROM or ISO by a user-desired amount, causing varied effects, both visually and audibly, to a video game and its data, including but not limited to displaced or misdirected pixels in a sprite map, never-ending levels, artifacts, distorted or entirely incorrect sprites, polygons, textures, or character models, spastic animations, incorrect text or dialogue trees, flickering graphics or lights, incorrect or distorted audio, inconvenient invisible walls, lack of collision detection, and other forced glitches, usually meant to be done for humorous effect. Most often, the end result is unwinnable. If the game doesn't end up freezing in some way or entirely crashing the Corruptor and associated programs as a whole. Cover system, a gameplay mechanics which allows the player to use walls or other features of the game's environment to take cover from oncoming ranged attacks, typically gunfire in first-person shooters. Many cover systems also allow the character to use range attacks in return while in cover, although with an accuracy penalty. CPU versus CPU C0 player game crafting. To craft an item in-game, Minecraft takes advantage of this feature. Critical hit, a type of hit that will do more damage than usual. Normally a rare occurrence without upgrades. Cross-platform, see multi-platform. Crowd control, an ability that allows to affect large amounts of enemies, is a specific area. For example, with an AO effect. See RPG, abbreviation of computer, console, role-playing game cutscene, a short video which can explain the story. Cybersport, see electronic sports. D-pad, a four-directional rocker button that allows the player to direct game action in 8 different directions: up, down, left, right, and the diagonals involving these. Invented by Gunpei Yokoi for the Game & Watch series of handheld consoles. Nintendo used the directional pad for their Nintendo Entertainment System controller, and it has been used on nearly every console controller since. Damage over time, an effect, such as poison or catching on fire, that reduces a player's health over the course of time or turns. Damage per second, used as a metric in some games to allow the player to determine their offensive power. Day 1, the day of release for a video game. Debuff, the opposite of a buff, an effect placed on a character that negatively impacts their statistics and characteristics. Can also refer to effects that nullify or cancel the effects of buffs. Also known as a nerf. Design, see video game design. Development, the development period of a game. Dialogue tree, found primarily in adventure games. A means of providing a menu of dialogue choices to the player when interacting with a non-player character as to learn more from that character, influence the character's actions, and otherwise progress the game's story. The tree nature comes from typically having multiple branching levels of questions and replies that can be explored. Difficulty: how hard the hashtag level is. Digital rights management software tools for copyright protection. Directional pad: see D-pad. Display mode: see attract mode. DLC abbreviation for downloadable content. Dota abbreviation of Defense of the Ancients, and sometimes used as a moniker to describe similar multiplayer online battle arena games. Double jump: an additional jump that follows the first in quick succession. Downloadable content: additional content for a video game that is acquired through digital download and often requiring additional purchase. DPM abbreviation of damage per minute, used as a metric in some games to allow the player to determine their offensive power. DPS abbreviation of damage per second. DRM abbreviation of digital rights management. Dungeon: sea level dungeon crawl, a type of video game that is based around exploring a dungeon or similar setting, defeating monsters and collecting loot. Dynamic game difficulty balancing. Emulator: a software program that is designed to replicate the software and hardware of a video game console on more modern computers and other devices. Emulators typically include the ability to load in software images of cartridges and other similar hardware-based game distribution methods from the earlier hardware generations. In addition to more traditional software images, electronic sports organize competitions around video games, typically using games from the first-person shooter and multiplayer online battle arena genres, and often played for prizes and recognition. Endgame or Endgame: the gameplay available in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game for characters that have completed their level. Progression: emergent gameplay strategies of play that use the game environment in ways unintended by the game developer, e.g., scaling a wall by placing proximity mines in Deus Ex. Esp Cheats: a package of multiple cheats, e.g., distance. Esp shows the distance between the enemy and the player. Player Esp makes enemies highly visible, and weapon Esp shows enemy weapons. Esports: see electronic sports experience point in games that feature the ability for the player character to gain levels such as CRPGs and JRPGs. Experience points are used to denote progress towards the next level.